Though refraining from actual participation in Austrian party politics, young Hitler already was beginning to practice his oratory on the audiences which he found in Vienna's flophouses, soup kitchens, and on its street corners. It was to develop into a talent, as this author, who later was to listen to scores of his most important speeches, can testify, more formidable than any other in the Germany between the wars, and it was to contribute in a large measure to his astounding success. And finally, in Hitler's Vienna experience, there were the Jews. In Linz, he says, there had been few Jews. At home, I do not remember having heard the word during my father's lifetime. At high school, there was a Jewish boy, but we didn't give the matter any thought. I even took them, the Jews, for Germans. According to Hitler's boyhood friend, this is not the truth. When I first met Adolf Hitler, says August Kubizek, recalling their days together in Linz, his anti-Semitism was already pronounced. Hitler was already a confirmed anti-Semite when he went to Vienna. And although his experiences in Vienna might have deepened this feeling, they certainly did not give birth to it. Then, says Hitler, I came to Vienna. Preoccupied by the abundance of my impressions, oppressed by the hardship of my own lot, I gained at first no insight into the inner stratification of the people of this gigantic city. Notwithstanding that Vienna in those days counted nearly 200,000 Jews among its 2 million inhabitants, I did not see them. The Jew was still characterized for me by nothing but his religion, and therefore on grounds of human tolerance I maintained my rejection of religious attacks in this case as in others. Consequently, the tone of the Viennese anti-Semitic press seemed to me unworthy of the cultural tradition of a great nation. One day, Hitler recounts, he went strolling through the inner city. I suddenly encountered an apparition in a black caftan and black sidelocks. Is this a Jew? Was my first thought, for to be sure they had not looked like that in Linz. I observed the man furtively and cautiously, but the longer I stared at this foreign face, scrutinizing feature for feature, the more my first question assumed a new form. Is this a German? Hitler's answer may be readily guessed. He claims, though, that before answering he decided to try to relieve my doubts by books. He buried himself in anti-Semitic literature, which had a large sale in Vienna at the time. Then he took to the streets to observe the phenomenon more closely. Wherever I went, he says, I began to see Jews, and the more I saw, the more sharply they became distinguished in my eyes from the rest of humanity. Later I often grew sick to the stomach from the smell of these caftan wearers. Next, he says, he discovered the moral stain on this chosen people. Was there any form of filth or profligacy, particularly in cultural life, without at least one Jew involved in it? If you cut even cautiously into such an abscess, you found, like a maggot in a rotting body, often dazzled by the sudden light, a kike. The Jews were largely responsible, he says he found, for prostitution and the white slave traffic. When for the first time, he relates, I recognized the Jew as the cold-hearted, shameless, and calculating director of this revolting vice traffic in the scum of the big city, a cold shudder ran down my back. There is a great deal of morbid sexuality in Hitler's ravings about the Jews. This was characteristic of Vienna's anti-Semitic press of the time, as it later was to be of the obscene Nuremberg weekly Der Stürmer, published by one of Hitler's favorite cronies, Julius Streicher, Nazi boss of Franconia, a noted pervert and one of the most unsavory characters in the Third Reich. Mein Kampf is sprinkled with lurid allusions to uncouth Jews seducing innocent Christian girls and thus adulterating their blood. Hitler can write of the nightmare vision of the seduction of hundreds of thousands of girls by repulsive, crooked-legged Jew bastards. As Rudolf Olden has pointed out, one of the roots of Hitler's anti-Semitism may have been his tortured sexual envy. Though he was in his early 20s, so far as is known, he had no relations of any kind with women during his sojourn in Vienna. Gradually, Hitler relates, I began to hate them. For me, this was the time of the greatest spiritual upheaval I have ever had to go through. I had ceased to be a weak-kneed cosmopolitan and become an anti-Semite. He was to remain a blind and fanatical one to the bitter end. His last testament, written a few hours before his death, would contain a final blast against the Jews as responsible for the war which he had started, and which was now finishing him and the Third Reich. This burning hatred, which was to infect so many Germans in that empire, would lead ultimately to a massacre so horrible and on such a scale as to leave an ugly scar on civilization that will surely last as long as man on earth. In the spring of 1913, Hitler left Vienna for good and went to live in Germany, where his heart, he says, had always been. He was 24, and to everyone except himself he must have seemed a total failure. He had not become a painter nor an architect. He had become nothing, so far as anyone could see, but a vagabond, an eccentric, bookish one, to be sure. He had no friends, no family, no job, no home. He had, however, one thing: an unquenchable confidence in himself and a deep, burning sense of mission. Probably he left Austria to escape military service. This was not because he was a coward, but because he loathed the idea of serving in the ranks with Jews, Slavs, and other minority races of the empire. Since 1910, when he was 21, he had been subject to military service. According to Haydn, the Austrian authorities could not put their finger on him while he was in Vienna. They finally located him in Munich and ordered him to report for examination in Linz. Josef Greiner, in his Das Ende des Hitler-Mythos, publishes some of the correspondence between Hitler and the Austrian military authorities, in which Hitler denies that he went to Germany to avoid Austrian military service. On the ground that he lacked funds, he requested to be allowed to take his examination in Salzburg because of its nearness to Munich. He was examined there on February 5, 1914, and found unfit for military or even auxiliary service on account of poor health. Apparently, he still had a lung ailment. His failure to report for military service until the authorities finally located him at the age of 24 must have bothered Hitler when his star rose in Germany. Greiner confirms a story that was current in anti-Nazi circles when I was in Berlin, that when the German troops occupied Austria in 1938, Hitler ordered the Gestapo to find the official papers relating to his military service. The records in Linz were searched in vain, to Hitler's mounting fury. They had been removed by a member of the local government who, after the war, showed them to Greiner. In Mein Kampf, Hitler states that he went to Munich in the spring of 1912, but this is an error. A police register lists him as living in Vienna until May 1913. His own stated reasons for leaving Austria are quite grandiose. My inner revulsion toward the Habsburg state steadily grew. I was repelled by the conglomeration of races which the capital showed me, repelled by this whole mixture of Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Serbs, and Croats, and everywhere the eternal mushroom of humanity, Jews and more Jews. To me, the giant city seemed the embodiment of racial desecration. The longer I lived in the city, the more my hatred grew for the foreign mixture of peoples which had begun to corrode this old site of German culture. For all these reasons, a longing rose stronger and stronger in me to go at last whither since my childhood secret desires and secret love had drawn me. His destiny in that land he loved so dearly was to be such as not even he, in his wildest dreams, could have then imagined. He was and would remain until shortly before he became Chancellor, technically a foreigner, an Austrian, in the German Reich. It is only as an Austrian who came of age in the last decade before the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, who failed to take root in its civilized capital, who embraced all the preposterous prejudices and hates then rife among its German-speaking extremists, and who failed to grasp what was decent and honest and honorable in the vast majority of his fellow citizens, were they Czechs or Jews or Germans, poor or well-off, artists or artisans, that Hitler can be understood. It is doubtful if any German from the north, from the Rhineland in the west, from East Prussia, or even from Bavaria in the south, could have had in his blood and mind out of any possible experience exactly the mixture of ingredients which propelled Adolf Hitler to the heights he eventually reached. To be sure, there was added a liberal touch of unpredictable genius. But in the spring of 1913, his genius had not yet shown. In Munich, as in Vienna, he remained penniless, friendless, and without a regular job. And then in the summer of 1914 the war came, snatching him, like millions of others, into its grim clutches. On August 3rd he petitioned King Ludwig III of Bavaria for permission to volunteer in a Bavarian regiment, and it was granted. This was the heaven-sent opportunity. Now the young vagabond could satisfy not only his passion to serve his beloved adopted country in what he says he believed was a fight for its existence, to be or not to be, but he could escape from all the failures and frustrations of his personal life. To me, he wrote in Mein Kampf, those hours came as a deliverance from the distress that had weighed upon me during the days of my youth. I am not ashamed to say that, carried away by the enthusiasm of the moment, I sank down on my knees and thanked heaven out of the fullness of my heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live in such a time. For me, as for every German, there now began the most memorable period of my life. Compared to the events of this gigantic struggle, all the past fell away into oblivion. For Hitler, the past, with all its shabbiness, loneliness, and disappointments, was to remain in the shadows, though it shaped his mind and character forever afterward. The war, which now would bring death to so many millions, brought for him, at 25, a new start in life.